Well, let's get started. I think everybody's here, and we're all probably want to get home to see if anybody's been robbed tonight. So we don't want to be don't want to be here too long. I thank you for taking time out of what are always busy lives to be with us. And basically, tonight what we're going to do is I've got a few comments, and we have a guest speaker who I'll introduce you to in a few minutes, and he's going to talk sort of about the history of the relationship between citizens and the state, and how they can work together to keep themselves safe and within the context of, I guess you'd say, the rule of law. So we'd really like to be out of here by 9:30 at the absolute latest. We want to talk about the history of this whole issue, and then we want to talk about some solutions. I think we all know the problem, so I don't think there's any point in going over like all the, that we could be here till, next Monday if we all wanted to tell our respective stories about who'd been robbed and how recently. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to, we're going to talk about where we're at, and then we're going to try and have some, we've got some suggestions as a group, and then we'll certainly have an opportunity for people to comment on our suggestions and to make your own suggestions. But let's work our way through it, and we'll see. How many of you folks were at the Manville Rural Crime Meeting? Like, I was there. There was, what about Marwayne? How many were at Marwayne? And again, then we had the Kitscoty Rural Crime Annual Meeting. And so, anyway, over the course of the last, I guess it's the last 2.5 or 3 months, we've had, 300, 200, another 100 at, various meetings talking about rural crime and the problems that we're having. And for those of you who are there, this will be sort of a refresher, but for those of you that weren't, like, there was two main themes came out of all three of the meetings. And at every one of the meetings, at some point, someone asked, someone from the government in Manville, it was actually the Crown Prosecutor, and in Marwayne and Kitscoty, it was actually our CMP representatives, but they were asked, like, can we shoot these intruders? And without exception, the answer was, like, virtually the same. They said, yes, like, you can shoot them, but be sure you shoot them in the chest, and be sure you kill them. And if you do, you'll certainly get charged, but you'll probably get off. And in fact, Gerald Stanley in Battleford a couple of weeks ago, he proved that was actually true. He did shoot them, and he was charged, and he did get off. But that isn't the rest of the story. The rest of the story is, irrespective of whether he has any personal anguish from having actually shot someone, he's going to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering when somebody's going to get even with him by shooting him, or worse yet, by shooting one of his kids or one of his grandkids. And so that suggestion, as much as it sounds good in the coffee shop, is like a lot of the things we get from the government. It sounds good, but it's not, and it's true, but it's not very practical. And so we want to talk about like something better. We want an alternative to that before the evening is over. The other theme that came up, at all three meetings was the representatives from the government said, well, get used to it, because we don't have the resources to do anything about it. So you're just going to have to get used to it. So for those of you who are at the Kitscoty meeting, I made a few suggestions, which I'll get to in a little bit. But I just wanted to, I had another friend who called me, and I mean, some of these, well, I guess I don't really know what all these crimes are based on, but some of them are certainly, based on drugs and one thing and another, the illegal drugs and one thing and another. And one of my friends said to me, well, I've got the solution. What we need to do is we just need to give them all the drugs they want in jail, and hopefully they'll just kill themselves. And I, of course, I wouldn't tell you his name, because he's one of the nicest people I've ever known in my whole life, but he's so frustrated, he's saying things that don't make sense. And I told him that too. I said, I know you don't believe that, and don't even talk that way. This drug thing is like cancer. There isn't any of us who don't have a loved one that's been affected by it. So let's try and think of a sensible solution to this. This frustration reminds me of a Gary Larson poster I used to have, and it was a young buzzard and an old buzzard sitting on a branch, and clearly the old buzzard was saying, be patient, be patient. And the young buzzard, the caption was, patience my ass, I'm going to kill something. You know what I mean? And that's, quite frankly, that's the frustration that we're all feeling, but I don't think it's a helpful feeling. So I guess today I'm the old buzzard saying, let's be patient. of course we're all frustrated, and Mr. Dress Up, he's traveling the world giving away our money. Like the last I heard, it was in the 8 to 10 to $12 billion. Today I see where we've lent money to somebody from South Africa to buy a plane, and now the plane has disappeared. And yet, as you probably all heard, when veterans were asking him for money, he said, you veterans, you're asking for more than we are able to give. And so when we ask his representatives, what can we do? We're getting the same answer from them. We don't have the resources to help you. Well, clearly, I guess we have whatever resources that we decide to use. So, I said this wouldn't be a sort of a complaining session, and I just want to tell you one more story before I get around to introducing our guest speaker. And this issue didn't just come up, but I was at a meeting a few years ago, and there was an older fellow there who, he was telling us a story, but he said in his youth he was happily on the road to a life of crime, and he got into trouble and he got 2 years and 2 lashes. And he said that's quite an experience, but he said it changed his life. And he said when he got out, he knew he would never be back again. And he said, like he said, we often, he said clearly it saves society a lot of misery, a lot of cost in chasing them down and keeping them in one thing and another. But he said what we often miss in that scenario is, he said, it actually saved his life, because he said he wasn't proud of what he'd done to get the lashes, but he said, I'm proud of what I've done with my life since I got the lashes. And he said, and that's the important thing. He said, now I've got a wife, and I've got kids, and I've got family, and I, like a lot of people, made some mistakes in my youth, but at the end of my life, I'm proud with what I've accomplished in my life. And I think that's what we're trying to aim at here today. Say as you like, this idea of shooting somebody, like it will ruin your life. It may save your TV, but it will ruin your life. And so we're, over the course of the evening, I'd like to talk about, some, positive things that we can do. We've got John here talk. John is he's a historian and a documentary filmmaker. He's got a PhD in history. I call him a modern-day Paul Harvey because he always has the rest of the story, and he's spoken to us on many occasions, and I always call them stories from the past and lessons for the future. And tonight his topic is particularly pertinent to what we're doing. He did a documentary which he'll tell you about on the Magna Carta going back hundreds of years, and so he's going to talk about the basis of the rule of law that we're all planning on living by. So without further ado, I'll ask you to welcome John Robson to our meeting. So thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you all for being here. I would say I'm glad to see you, but I'm actually sorry that you're here. It is very wrong that you should have to attend meetings like this. And what I'm here to talk about is why it's wrong and how fundamentally we got into a mess, into a situation in which your concerns about crime are not being taken seriously. Now, as you probably guessed from my attire, I'm not from around here. I'm actually from Ottawa, and I would have liked to borrow some of Mr. Trudeau's costumes, but I gather they're on their way back to Disney World, so I shouldn't say that. I like Disney World. But the reason that I'm here, and the reason that you're here, is that government in Canada, the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments are failing to do the most important thing that governments exist to do, and that is to protect the safety of the citizens. And when your safety is not being protected, and you complain to government, and they tell you, take care of it yourself and we'll come after you, or they tell you, get used to it. John Locke is the great theorist of freedom, and he said the reason we enter into society, the reason we form governments is to be protected. And he said it is inconceivable that we should accept as a condition of belonging to society and having a government that we don't get the thing that we created governments in order to get, which is that we get protected. Protected from invasion, protected from subversion, and protected from crime and disorder. So how on earth could this be happening? Maybe you started thinking rural crime is a terrible problem, but it's one of those things that exist. But why? How could we in Canada be in a situation where the government is indifferent to us? And my answer is because government has forgotten who's the master. Throughout our history, it is the people who have been in charge, and the government has been obliged to make the people's priorities its priorities, and that's not happening anymore. And so one of the major points I want to make here today, I imagine a number of you are fans of Jordan Peterson, who is standing up to this tidal wave of nonsense coming out of academia. And one of the pieces of advice that Jordan Peterson gives people is stand up straight and put your shoulders back. And we need to do that when we're faced with government. When government says, sorry, I can't be bothered, we need to stand up straight, look them in the eye and say, oh, yes, you can. And you will, because we are going to insist that you do it one way or another. You can do it the easy way or the hard way, but it's going to happen. If the police will not do their job, then we will go to the politicians. If the politicians won't do their job, we will get a new political party. We will make sure that we fix what is wrong in this country. And what is wrong in this country is something that people nowadays maybe would think is a bit odd. But what's wrong? Canada is and has always been a free country. Canada was founded on freedom. Our heritage going back hundreds of years is of a free people who did not let their government tell them what to do. And I know crime is a practical problem, and some people may be thinking I've gotten a little abstract here, but you've heard the kind of advice that you get from government at these meetings. Either you go ahead and shoot them and then we'll come and charge you, as though you were the problem, or else tough bananas, put up with it, because the crime is not a problem that matters to us. And this idea that they can't afford to deal with crime. You know, the federal government is spending around $800 million a day. But don't worry, it's going to be up to $1 billion quite soon. The Alberta government's spending $150 million a day. It all came from you, and it's meant to be spent the way you think it needs to be spent. And there's a lot of disagreement in the political arena, but there is very little disagreement about whether people ought to be safe in their own homes. That is not a major issue of controversy. And before I head back to medieval London, which I will do, and then I'll get you back here without droning on for 3 hours, I want to talk about the very famous policing principles that were laid down by Robert Peel when he created the very first professional police force in England, in London, in the 19th century. We talk about this, next slide, in the documentary, A Right to Arms, that we did. And by the way, I'm all crowdfunded. I make a living by making documentaries and selling DVDs and so on. They're for sale at the back. But I promised my wife I wouldn't bring back a suitcase full of them, so I'm in a weak bargaining position. They cost $20, but I'll take your best offer because I'm not allowed to come home with them. But when the first police force was formed in London, the police were not armed. The British were very uneasy about having a government that had guns, even when they did, let alone if they didn't. They regarded law and order and crime and punishment as a fundamental responsibility and right of the citizens. And so Robert Peel laid down these principles, and the one that I really want to talk about here is number 7. He said that the police must maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. The police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interest of community welfare and existence. That's what policing is meant to be about, that the police are just you in uniform with a salary, and that they are treating the situation the way you would treat it. And that's obviously not happening today. Some of you will probably have seen this picture. Next slide, please. That essentially the state thinks you're the problem. And they're not allowed to think that. They've never been allowed to think that in the English-speaking world, and they're not allowed to think it now. Some of you may have watched the Prime Minister, next slide, when the Colton Boushie case was nearing completion. And he talked about having talked to his mum, Debbie. And at the time I said, does he even know the name of Gerald Stanley's wife? The Prime Minister was prejudicing justice. He was criticizing the outcome. He was implying that the jury had let a guy get away with it because he was a violent bigot. The Prime Minister of Canada, is that really what he thinks about the people who elected him? And next slide, too much of the press seemed to agree. Even the National Post, which is not a left-wing paper, was full of the suffering of his family, the likelihood of unrest if the verdict were not guilty. Before it came down, the National Post was saying you're going to have a conflagration if you don't convict this guy, which has nothing to do with whether or not he was actually guilty. And we need fair justice for Colton, and on it went. Now, obviously, I'm not calling for bigotry, but that's not the point. The idea that the people who come to this meeting are only concerned because they think they've got a crime problem with people of a different race from them is ridiculous as well as insulting. The idea that if you knew for sure it was white people stealing your stuff, you'd be cool with it, is so absurd that it's odd that you have to even mention it. And yet, at this point, that's one of the lines that they use to try not to deal with this problem. And so, when I made this documentary, A Right to Arms, which is about self-defense, what it used to be, what's happened to the law, what needs to happen, I started out with what might sound like an abstract question, but I said you can't talk about any of this unless you ask this. I said, what kind of people are Canadians? And I don't think racist murderers is the answer. I said we're a free people. We are independent. We are competent. We can make our own decisions. We can make our own decisions about where we work and who we marry, and if need be, how we protect ourselves. And I said, if that's not true, why do they let us vote? They must believe, at least once every 4 years, that we know what we're doing. And what's more, that is how Canada was built. And so the right to arms is part of a constitutional trilogy. Next slide, please. There are actually 3 documentaries, and they're all available free on YouTube. That's how hard it is to sell them to you. You can have them free because they're all crowdfunded. But it talks about the foundation of Canadian society, about the institutions that have made us the envy of the world. Why are we prosperous? Why are we generous? Why is our country the envy of the world? And the answer is because we've always been a free people. And as I point out in the Right to Arms documentary, people say, oh, that's un-Canadian, this talk of freedom and self-defense, that's not who we are. So, well, here are 3 people who were very much in favor of it. Sir John A. Macdonald, William Lyon Mackenzie, and Louis Riel. Every single one of them was an advocate of the right to bear arms. And they were all advocates of the right to bear arms because it was a guarantee both of personal security and of political freedom. That wasn't even controversial when Canada was founded. And that means that this whole idea that you don't get to control your government is actually un-Canadian. And I think we need to take that idea back in our practical dealings. Of course, a lot of you have very sensible, nitty-gritty, down-to-earth ideas, and we'll talk about those. But here's the problem. You've all thought of this one. The police should arrest criminals and the judges should put them away. Right? It's not hard to think of that. But it doesn't happen just because you thought of it. It doesn't happen just because you call the police. It doesn't happen just because somebody gets identified and charged. There's something very wrong here. And that's why I'm going to take us back to Magna Carta to explain what went right as well as what's going wrong. It's going to be 800 years and 25 minutes because I promise not to drone on at you. You know, I'd always known about Magna Carta, but when I started studying it, I discovered that it contains things like nullus liber homo capiatur. And you're probably thinking, well, yeah, that's not a language I speak. But next slide, please. It actually is. Because what it says is no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or deprived of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or have anything else bad done to him except by the judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. That's 800 years ago. Well, it's 803 years ago now, but you know, kids will tell you they're 5 and a half. Nobody says they're 70 and a half. The 3 years doesn't matter anymore. This is 8 centuries ago. The people of England extracted a promise from a nasty king, bad King John. And there's one book that I read that said, did he deserve to be called bad King John? Said, no, he was much worse than that. But also, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Magna Carta guaranteed people that they would not be bullied or jailed by the state, that they would be tried by their peers. And now we see, well, we've got to do something about the jury system because Gerald Stanley was acquitted by a jury of his peers. They want to throw this out. Well, there's a reason King John wasn't allowed to throw it out. They didn't want the king's courts deciding who went to jail. They wanted the people deciding, ultimately, was this person reasonable or not in what they did? And to no one will we sell, deny, or delay justice. They don't sell justice today in the sense of being corrupt. Don't go into court with an envelope full of money. This will not help. But it's so expensive that for all practical purposes, justice is only available to the rich and sometimes not even to them. As Danny said, you shoot somebody in justified self-defense, you get tried, you get off, you're $150,000 in debt. What are you meant to do about that? Well, sell your farm, I guess. It's not the prosecutor's problem. They lose the case, they still get paid. And trials take forever. It's not meant to be that way because it's not meant to be done for the convenience of the state. Another interesting provision of Magna Carta, next slide, by the way, and you see this rule of law is still in our Constitution. This is still part of our lives. Next slide. Ordinary lawsuits shall not follow the royal court, but shall be held in a fixed place. And the reason this is important is that the king in those days was a very, very active person. Next slide. King Henry II, John's father, owned all this part of France, and he rode horse around it constantly. He traveled 2,000 miles a year. You'd only running after the king, clutching at his muddy boot. But in England, you didn't have to. There was a court where you lived, where you could go to get justice from your fellows, who would decide whether you were in fact guilty or whether the law was so stupid that they wouldn't convict you, even if technically they'd sort of shown that you did it. And here's another thing from Magna Carta, by the way. Next slide. No constable or other royal official shall take corn or other movable goods from any man without immediate payment. Property rights were guaranteed in a way that they're not today. People will tell you, oh, things were so awful in the old days and so much better today. It's not true. Under Magna Carta, things were much better. There's even, next slide, a guarantee of women's rights. And this was necessary, that the widow would get her inheritance at once and she would not be compelled to marry, because King John was such a bankrupt weasel that if he saw some woman whose husband had died and she had land and money, he'd force her to marry one of his wretched followers. And so Magna Carta says, no, women have the right to decide whether to remarry and when. And it also says, this one is the one that in some way amazed me the most, no scutage or aid may be levied in our kingdom without its general consent, unless for the ransom to make our eldest son a knight, and once to marry our daughter. And the reason it says once is because John would have married his daughter 13 times if he could have made them all show up with wedding gifts. But scutage or aid is how they raised taxes in those days. So this is in 1215, no taxation without representation. This is who we're descended from, if not biologically, certainly politically, which is what matters. This is the cornerstone of Canada, is a government that was well under control. And Magna Carta was read out loud in the cathedrals twice a year, so even the illiterate would know what it said. This was for everybody. Next slide. And this is being pointed out in the 17th century by an eminent jurist and political opponent of absolutism, that Magna Carta, all free men, applies even to serfs. That's where we come from. The only country in the world where even serfs were guaranteed fundamental human rights 800 years ago. And Magna Carta is looking backward, not forward, but I won't get into that, really. Next slide, please. Except they were idolizing, the only king in English history called the Great is Alfred the Great, and he lived in the 9th century. And you see him there, in one with the axe at repose and the law scroll in his hand, and the other one with the sword inverted to form a cross. Because this is the king who rescued the kingdom from terrible danger and then ruled justly. And Alfred was always a model, hence the tale of Alfred and the cakes, which I will not tell today. and that of King Canute. You probably know Canute was the guy who thought he could stop the tide, right? Yuck, yuck, yuck. Do you know the story of King Canute? I don't know if poor Canute, he's vanished from the stage. Anyway, the real story of King Canute is this. He's a king in England in the 11th century, and his courtiers are telling him he's such a great king, so wonderful, such a favorite of God, that he can even stop the tide. And Canute says, gosh, that's an interesting view. Let's try it out. Evidence-based decision-making. Take my chair down at low tide to the edge of the water. And they do, and he sits down in it, and when the waves come in, he says, I am Canute the Great, I command you to halt. And of course, the sea pours into his boots. And he stands up with soggy feet, and he turns to his courtiers, and he says, listen, you idiots, I'm the king. I get flattery all day long for free. You have to tell me what I can't do. You have to tell me what I'm doing wrong. You have to do that so I can govern these people the way they deserve. And don't think anybody but God is master of the waves. And that story was told in the English-speaking world for 1,000 years to tell us how we were meant to be governed. And we need to take that story back and tell it to our children and our grandchildren and say, this is who we are. There you won't find that story in France or in Persia or in Russia or in China of the humble emperor who knew he was to serve the people. It is a special heritage that we have, and we must demand that we be treated like those people. And by the way, this comes from the court of King Henry II. This is before Magna Carta. John of Salisbury, writing at the king's court, says the difference between the prince and the tyrant is that the prince obeys the law and governs his people in accordance with right. And he also said, not only is it lawful to slay the tyrant, but also it is right and just to do it. So he was telling the king to his face, if you oppress us, you die. And he was able to be at court and serve it. And as a result of this, there's a line when I teach American history that I quote to my students. Next slide, please. About somebody who called his country a land, perhaps the only one in the universe, in which political or civil liberty is the end and scope of the Constitution. And I say, boy, that's an American sentiment, don't you think? But it's not. That's William Blackstone, a leading English jurist, writing right before the American Revolution. That's your heritage. I don't think they teach this in schools. But we need to remember that this is who we are when the government tells us we can't be bothered with you. Your problems are not our problems, but your money is our money. That we can take $55 billion out of the citizens' pockets in Alberta. We can spend $10 billion more than we take in. We're willing to borrow $10 billion. That is almost 20% of all spending. It's more than 20% of all revenue for all the things we want to spend money on, but we haven't got the money for policing. Because policing's not important to us. Because we're not going to get our homes broken into, are we? Members of the legislature aren't worried about that. They've got armed guards, so you don't need them. And this kind of thinking was very influential, not just in America, but in Britain and in Canada, throughout the period leading up to and past Confederation. So we'll skip the next slide. There's so much that you can see in the documentaries. This is the tomb of Stephen Langton. I just want to mention, because I hadn't heard of him either. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury right before Magna Carta. And he defied the king. He's the one who wrote most of Magna Carta in its initial form. He's the one who convinced the barons and the clerics and the knights and everybody else that King John needed to be brought to heel. And after it happened, John cozied up to the Pope. He promised England to the Pope as a fief, so the Pope excommunicated the barons and annulled Magna Carta. And Stephen Langton refused to read that out aloud. This is the kind of courage over the years that kept us free and gave us a government that did not dare to tell us what to do. And in the reign of King John's son, John had a son, Henry III, who had all his father's minor vices, but none of his really scary ones. He created a zoo in London, by the way, and he had polar bears and lions, and said, if you want to come to the zoo, bring a dog or a cat to feed to the lion. So you can imagine that would get him in a lot of trouble today. What got him in trouble back then is that he kept spending money and was governing terribly. And so finally there's a revolt by his brother-in-law, a Frenchman named Simon de Montfort. And Montfort captures the king and his son. And what do you do when you've captured the king? How do you say, I'm in charge now and I'm the one you all have to obey? You know, most parts of the world, you'd make a big heap of skulls or slaughter 10,000 of your enemies. He dragged the king to Westminster and made him reissue Magna Carta, and then he summoned a parliament. In 1265, the first real parliament in English history, to which he invited the common people. 2 knights from every shire, 2 burgesses from every town, elected with an open franchise, no property qualification, 1 man, 1 vote. Montfort's life ended very badly. The king's son escaped, captured Montfort, killed him, mutilated his body in a hideous manner. And then he summoned a parliament, and he invited the common people, and he promised them no taxation without representation. This is how we got where we are. Well, okay, it's part of how we got where we are. But why did King John seal Magna Carta? Not because he had a change of heart, not because he became a nice guy. It's not like the Grinch, where his heart grows 3 sizes in the middle on Mount Crumpet. He did it because he was going to die otherwise. It was just very clear. And, next slide. I just have to say Sherwood Forest and you see Robin Hood, right? The most famous person perhaps in English history, though he never existed. But there he is, Robin Hood with his longbow. Robin Hood is not Robin Hood without his longbow, because he resists the tyranny of the king by armed force. That's who we are. And the Robin Hood stories are popular to this day because of that. And of course, as Danny was saying, you don't want to resort to violence. I am not in favor of vigilante justice. But it's nice for the government to know that you can look after yourselves if you absolutely have to. And so what happens because of this? How do you keep the king in line? Parliament develops. The House of Commons starts to sit separately. It starts to elect its own speaker to count the votes and run its own affairs. And by the very beginning of the 15th century, Parliament has taken control, the House of Commons, of its own affairs and of spending. They have told the king he must grant what they want before he can get any money. They've told the House of Lords that they have the final say on money bills, and they've told the king he can't edit them. Once they've passed a bill, that's the law. And this didn't happen anywhere else in the world, not even places like France and Spain, which are really pretty nice places by world standards. But only in England does it happen, and only in England does it stick. The kings don't like it, of course. The kings are always trying to take over and stop listening to people, but they never get away with it. They come pretty close in the early 17th century. The Stuarts, especially Charles I. And Charles does not want to listen to Parliament. He wants to raise money without people's permission. He wants to make laws that they don't have a say in. But Parliament rises up, and Edward Coke, in a very famous debate, tells the king, Magna Carta is such a fellow that he will have no sovereign. That means this guarantee of the rights of the English cannot be overridden by the king, even if the king seduces Parliament. That we have God-given rights that no one may take away from us. And there's a classic episode, by the way, in the English Civil War. At one point, King Charles I leads a band of armed men into the House of Commons looking for 5 of his opponents, only to find that they're not there. So he grabs the speaker, William Lenthal, drags him out of his chair. The king sits in the chair. Somebody puts a sword to Lenthal's throat, and the king says, where are those 5 MPs? And Lenthal replies, in words that should be carved in Parliament, may it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here. And that's why our rights did not disappear in the 17th century, because people like Lenthal, who, by the way, was a spineless time server, nobody believed he would ever do this. When it mattered most, he found his courage and he stood up to the king. And the king eventually got beheaded. I don't know if you know all your English kings and queens. I grew up with this stuff. Charles I gets beheaded, and on the scaffold he says this. Next slide. For the people, I must tell you that their liberty consists in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may be most of their own. It is not having share in government. That is nothing pertaining to them. So you see, this is an old temptation. The king's idea that we'll all get along much better if you don't presume to tell me what I should be doing. If you'll just be grateful for the blessings I choose to bestow on you, and if you will let me take all the money I say I need, That's the way we ought to do things. That idea goes back hundreds of years. But so does the idea that this is absolute nonsense and must never be permitted. And so it is. Very famous statement by William Pitt the Elder. The poorest man may in his cottage bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may blow through it, the storm may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. That's 18th century Britain, and that's the Prime Minister talking. Your home is your castle. And this, in fact, is just channeling Edward Cook, next slide, who said, the house of everyone is to him as his castle and fortress for defense against injury and violence as for his repose. That's your farm he's talking about. And the government may not enter it, but they also cannot forbid you to protect yourself while you're in it. It is your castle and fortress. And that is the foundation of our political system. This is the view of the political elite in England for hundreds of years, even though the king tries not to let you have it. It never works. And the citizens are very much involved in preserving their rights, both against criminals and against the state. This is from a 1285 law. This is under Edward I. If criminals will not suffer themselves to be arrested, let hue and cry be raised against them, and those who keep watch shall follow with the whole ville, that's the village, together with the neighboring villages, until they are taken and handed over to the sheriff. And what's more, so that districts would not become lawless and complicit, if the district does not answer, they have to pay for what was stolen. This is a situation in which the citizens are in charge of law and order. They're not allowed to shirk their duty, but they're the ones who maintain watch and who enforce the law. And they are able and willing to do this in all kinds of situations. In the English Civil War, which happens in the 1640s against Charles I, more people are killed per capita in England than in the First World War. This was an exceptionally bloody affair. And both sides, the parliamentary and royal forces, tended to run amok and plunder and harass the inhabitants, to the point, this is issued in March of 1645 by a group called the Hereford Clubmen. These were citizens banding together, and they're called the Clubmen because many of them had nothing more than farm implements. Surprising number had guns, but many did not. And they were royalists, and so they sent a note to the local royal authorities saying, we're totally loyal to the king, don't worry about that for one moment. But finding no redress of our grievances, but that we, our wives and children, have been exposed to utter ruin by the outrages and violence of the soldier, threatening to fire our houses, endeavoring to ravish our wives and daughters, and menacing our persons, we are now enforced to associate ourselves in a mutual league for each other's defense. And tens of thousands of Englishmen formed armed bands to protect home and hearth against anybody who threatened it. And when the Stuarts were ousted in 1688, the English Bill of Rights, among other things, guaranteed the citizens the right to bear arms, except Catholics. They were very anti-Catholic, and I think we probably have improved on that. Some of you might not agree, but I think most of you would. And when the Stuarts were chased out, this is also when John Locke came back from exile and wrote his very famous book about why we have rights and how our rights work. And he started out, every man has a property in his own person that no one can have a right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. And this is why when something is stolen and they say it was just stuff, this is an outrageous thing to say. No, this is what somebody did with their time and effort, possibly over many years. What if somebody has been in a place for 50 years and then the stuff is stolen? The things they made with their children when they were little, all the meaning in their life is embodied in the things they've chosen to make and keep. It's an extension of who you are. And I don't think anybody today would deny in principle that we own ourselves. Slavery has very few advocates today. We own our own bodies, we own our own labor. Because it doesn't mean much to say you're free if I can grab your body and drag it off to the cotton field or the harem or something like that. But if we own ourselves, we clearly have the right to protect ourselves. And Locke says, yeah, this is why we form governments, is so that we will not lose our life, our liberty, and our property. That's what it's all about. And the government cannot possibly take these things from you, actively or by indifference, without losing its legitimacy. And that is what is happening today, and it concerns me a great deal. It's a kind of social breakdown we very much do not want to see happen. But it's one that we are not obliged to stand by passively and let happen to us. And Locke says, it's lawful for a man to kill a thief who has not hurt him, nor said he's going to hurt him, but is simply using force to get him in his power. Because, Locke says, he has no right to get me into his power, let his pretense be what it will, and I have no reason to suppose that he who would take away my liberty would not, when he had me in his power, take away everything else. So this is where the right of self-defense comes from. Locke says if somebody steals a fortune from you and gets away with it, you can't go and hunt him down. You've got to go to the cops. But in a situation where you don't know what will happen, if you let him get control over you, you are entitled to defend your life with deadly force if need be. And I make this point in an urban setting in the documentary. If a man breaks into a woman's apartment and says, don't worry, I'm just here for your money, I'm going to tie you up and search your apartment, would anybody say she's obliged to say, that's fine, I'm sure you have nothing more sinister in mind? Well, you know, she's not allowed to have a gun. She's not allowed to have pepper spray. She's not allowed to have weapons. The law in Canada is very, very broad on what you're not allowed to do. And again, Locke says, next slide, the reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property. It can never be supposed to be the will of society that the legislative should have a power to destroy that which everyone designs to secure by entering into society. The legislature cannot tell you it's a condition of living in a civilized society that you submit to crime, to violence, to robbery, and to outrage. That's where we came from. And when the American colonies were founded, they took Magna Carta with them to Massachusetts, to Pennsylvania, to Virginia, everywhere they went. The state seal of Massachusetts during the American Revolution is a guy with a sword in one hand and a scroll in the other. And if you look closely at the scroll, it says Magna Carta on it. That's what they understood themselves to be fighting for. But it's also what the people who founded Canada understood themselves to have fought for and to stand for. There's a classic, Joseph Howe, before he became a politician, was a newspaper editor, and he was exposing corruption in the government of the colony of Nova Scotia. And finally he was arrested and he was charged with libel. And the judge told the jury, truth is not a defense in libel. And that was the case in British law at the time. It didn't matter if what you said was true. It only mattered if it damaged the reputation. And Howe stood up and he said to the jury, you must refuse to enforce that law. And you wouldn't think today that Canadian founders would have talked like this, but he said, will you permit the sacred fire of liberty brought by your fathers from the venerable temples of Britain to be quenched and trodden out on the simple altars your ancestors have raised? And you know what the jury did? They acquitted him. They overturned the law because they said the law was unfit for free people. And they would not convict. So the right to trial by jury that's in Magna Carta is instrumental 600 years later in making sure that people can agitate against a corrupt colonial administration. And then Howe helps bring representative government to Nova Scotia, having disposed of this ridiculous law. Now, a lot has gone wrong with this in the 20th century, and again, I'm not going to try your patience further here. It's in the documentaries, but this is the Harper administration at one point. And the blue is Tories, the orange is NDP, the red is Liberals, and the Greens. But the white squares are ministers. And the reason this is important is that an enormous proportion of the Harper legislative, the MPs, were actually members of the executive branch. The executive branch has devoured the legislature. And this is really important because when you elect people now and you send them to Edmonton or to Queen's Park or to Ottawa, they stop being part of the legislature that's meant to be on your side, and they become part of the executive that wants you to stop complaining and pay up. Even worse, this was when the Ontario Liberals were in minority. So there's Kathleen Wynne's MPPs. All but two of them are actually members of the executive branch. One of them's a speaker. I don't know what this other person did. I don't know how you'd be the one person. And if you're a member of the cabinet, you get extra money. And you get perks and you get a car, as long as you do what the premier says, not what those hicks who elected you say, because they don't understand. They don't realize how important what we're doing is. They keep telling us to have more police or something like that. Well, we can't do that. And the reason that I'm talking about all this and why I think we need to get this story back before we look government in the eye and tell it to stop messing around and start enforcing the law is something an American judge said in 1944, Judge Learned Hand, which is a ridiculous name, but there you are. We all have problems. He said, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it." And we must believe with all our hearts that we are free people, that the government is our servant, not our master, and that it will call us sir and ma'am, and it will make our priorities its priorities. We will not allow it to say that what matters to us does not matter to it. And this includes, in my view, when it comes to the right of self-defense. And it's a funny thing, if you look at the Sherlock Holmes stories, which I think are still very popular, Holmes will turn to Watson and say, "Gee, this is going to be dangerous. Do you have your revolver?" And Watson will say, "Yes." And nobody goes, "Holy cow, you can't have that. He's going to shoot Mrs. Hudson. Make him fill out a form about his sex life." Nobody thought that in Victorian Britain. There was actually a bill to regulate handguns in 1895, and the House of Commons sneered at it. They voted it down, calling it grandmotherly, unnecessary, and futile. Those were the days. And in fact, the BBC did a remake of Sherlock Holmes called Sherlock, very postmodern, very 21st century. Watson's an Afghan veteran. Holmes is a psychopathic drug addict. It's sort of sad to see it come to this. But in those stories, Watson carries an automatic. And when some lunatic is menacing Holmes, Watson whips the gun out, puts a bullet between his eyes, and the police don't show up and say, "Where did you get that gun?" They kind of go, "Well, that got rid of him." Because ordinary people understand perfectly well that although taking a human life is a very serious thing that no one would want to do, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And yet, what happened, of course, in Canada, Bill C-68, a lot of otherwise law-abiding people did not register their firearms. But it gets a lot worse than that. In Britain, stun guns are illegal, but a lot of people have them. You buy them online. A lot of people who just don't want to be robbed or raped or murdered are buying weapons that the government has made illegal because it thinks they should not be able to defend themselves even if the police are not there. And again, you had that episode in Germany, the Cologne, New Year's Eve, where there were all kinds of assaults on women, which the police lied about initially, claiming it hadn't even happened. Sales of pepper spray skyrocketed. So did sales of stun guns and fake weapons, which you need a license for in Germany, by the way. In Austria, shotguns sold out because they're less registered, and the primary people buying shotguns were women. They're not fanatics out of the set of deliverance. They're ordinary people who know you have a right to be safe. There was a famous case in Denmark in 2016. A 17-year-old girl was attacked by a man who tried to pull her pants down. She pepper sprayed him, and the police showed up, and they knew who to arrest. They arrested her. That is quite amazing. We've had this problem with, the storekeepers who are repeatedly robbed. Ian Thompson down in Port Colborne, Ontario, who had his property firebombed by people shouting death threats. He went and got his firearms out of his safe. He's a licensed firearms instructor, fired 3 warning shots. They fled. The police, of course, showed up, and they knew who to arrest. They arrested Thompson. And they charged him with careless use of a firearm and something else, and also unsafe storage. They dropped the first 2 charges early, but they went after him for 2 years for unsafe storage because during the incident, his guns weren't in his gun safe. That is the police using their discretion in ways that are repugnant to the wishes and the liberty of people. And there's no way that we should ever have to put up with it. There's a handbook. This is from a handbook for English justices of the peace in the 17th century. If thieves shall come to a man's house to rob or murder him, he may lawfully assemble company to defend his house by force. And if he or any of his company shall kill any of them in defense of himself, his family, his goods, or his house, this is no felony. Neither shall they forfeit anything therefore. And again, I'm not calling for vigilante justice, but you can imagine how thieves would react knowing this was the law. And they do know the law. In the same way they know that the police have been told to break off pursuit at 130 kilometers an hour. That means if they're on your tail, flee and you'll get away. And to preserve safety in one case, they jeopardize safety in hundreds of others, but not their safety, just yours. And that is no big deal to them. But that is not tolerable. That is not right. When I was doing the documentary, I phoned a number of police forces in Canada to ask, can a woman, well, I'll back up. Some years ago, I knew an active young lady, and she was often out alone and so on, and I said, gee, it's a dangerous world. Are you sure this is safe? And she reached into her purse and pulled out a wicked knife about this long and said, my fiance's father gave me this. Well, she's a criminal in this country. That is a concealed weapon. I checked this with the police. Not only are you not allowed to carry a knife for purposes of self-defense, but it's a concealed weapon. And I thought, if you look in a woman's purse, how many things are there because she's concealing them? Does she have concealed car keys? Concealed lip balm? A concealed packet of Kleenex? But the police use their discretion to say that's a concealed weapon and it's dangerous to the public peace. The law gives them leeway and they take every inch of it. The law is not unreasonable in self-defense in Canada, but the actions of the police in enforcing it with the support of their political masters and the courts is very unreasonable. Ottawa police told me it's a gray area. You're allowed to carry a pocket knife or something like that. It's what are your intentions? So any woman, and this, I imagine this is more true in urban than rural settings, any woman who's got something in her purse that she's thought to herself, if I'm alone in a parking lot and some creep starts stalking me, I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to put my keys between my fingers. I've got a knife. I've got a screwdriver. I've got pepper spray. Doesn't matter what it is. She is a criminal in the eyes of the law. And as you know, she's probably going to get prosecuted even if it proves that she was right to have it. There was an interview somebody did with the Halifax Regional Police saying you have the right to defend yourself, but you can't be carrying pepper spray or knives or guns for that purpose. If your intent to carry them is to defend yourself or harm someone, you could be charged with carrying a concealed weapon. The policeman did then say carry an air horn, but only use it to sound an alarm. If you point it at the guy and blast him with it with the aim of incapacitating him, once again, that item becomes a weapon. If it was in your purse, it's a concealed weapon, and you will be prosecuted. To what end? Is there in Halifax a plague of women whipping out air horns and blasting people out of malice? Is there a case in history of this happening? But this is the way they treat the law. And one of the reasons they treat it that way, Alan Rock, who I'm sure you all remember fondly, said in 1994, after saying only agents of the state should be armed, a sentiment that not even James I would have dared utter, or King John, he said, Canadians do not want to live in a society where they need to own a gun for protection. But the point is not whether we want to live in such a society, and I would like to live in a society in which no one ever even skins their knee, but I have Band-Aids at home. The question is whether we think we do live in a society where we need to own guns, and are we in fact right? But this kind of make-believe permeates. Pierre Trudeau, after he left office, applied for a concealed carry permit. That went down so badly he backed off. But that was an amazing expression of, I'm different than you, right? Because I'm me and you are you. And so we find ourselves in a situation where we have not improved our tradition, refined it, become more sensitive and sensible, but we have thrown it away for something totally different. And it's C.S. Lewis who talked about this idea of getting rid of your past values instead of just saying maybe we could do a bit better here. He said, it's the difference between a man who says to us, you like your vegetables moderately fresh, why not grow your own and have them perfectly fresh, and a man who says, throw away that loaf and try eating bricks and centipedes instead. That's what you're being asked to do right now, is eat bricks and centipedes. To live in fear and resignation is something nobody would ever have tolerated, and nobody in the history of the English-speaking people would have accepted hearing from their rulers going back to Roman Britain. Again, watch the documentary for some surprising stuff on that. But as G.K. Chesterton said, next slide, democracy means not the citizens voting, but the citizens ruling. And that's what has always been the case in the English-speaking world. When we say frog, the government jumps, not the other way around. And we need to get this clear. I mean, I said it will sound a bit abstract and beside the point, but it's not. Because we need to stand up for this view, and we need to be unapologetic, and we need to present it to other people and say, this is why we have the right to tell them to look after us, not have them tell us, we can't be bothered, and if you look after yourselves, we will take care of you, and I don't mean that in a good way. There's an old saying that it's hard to fight an enemy who has outposts in your head. And too many Canadians do have outposts in their head. They think we're not a free people. They think that a state that obeys the people is an American concept. Oh, yuck, an American concept. But it's not. It is as quintessentially Canadian as the right to bear arms. What are you going to do about this? Well, we're going to start talking about that. But will they let you do it? That's the real issue here. If the government were willing to respect your views and do its duty, we wouldn't be in this situation and we wouldn't be in this room. And we need, as we work out sensible ideas, not to have the police come and say, oh, no, you can't do that, you naughty people. I was being told there's one organization that's devoted to fighting rural crime that can't post anything on its website without the RCMP's go-ahead. The RCMP here being the immediate problem. I'm not unsympathetic to them. They don't exactly make the rules and they don't get to write their own budgets. But when you're complaining that the police are not protecting you and they say you can't post anything on your website that we don't like, you're not being allowed to complain. Who would dare to tell citizens you may not do this? You may not disapprove of a government agency without its approval. Well, King John would have. That's why they made him seal Magna Carta. That's not how we have ever done things in Canada, and we must stand proudly on this story of liberty and all the people who have risked and sacrificed and sometimes died to defend liberty in foreign wars, in domestic confrontations. Men like Cook, who stood toe-to-toe with the King of England and told him he was not above the law and very nearly lost his head for it and didn't back down. You're not going to lose your heads for this, so don't back down. Don't let them tell you you can't do it. If you want to report crime and figure out where vehicles are going that you know are suspicious, don't let the police tell you you're not allowed to do that. Don't let them ignore crime reports. Don't let the judges ignore the will of the people when it comes to appropriate treatment of criminals. You know, there's a saying that in courts and in prisons, 80% of the people are in trouble and the other 20% are trouble. And I'm not unsympathetic to Danny's story about the guy with the 2 years and the 2 lashes. To those people who are in trouble, let's get them out of trouble so they can be productive citizens. But those people who are trouble, we have a right to be protected from them. It's Bruce Montague, who they put through a ringer. He peacefully protested Bill C-68 by refusing to get the appropriate licenses. And he went through a 10-year ordeal, in the middle of which the government of Ontario decided to take his house as the proceeds of crime. It is an amazing story. $250,000 in legal fees. The seizure of all his weapons, which were his life savings and which were not returned. And worse, there's an interview with him in the Right to Arms documentary. He said, we have a right to life, and what good is a right to life without a means to defend that life? And I am very happy that the means to defend that life should be the state and its police forces and its courts. That is the civilized answer. But you have a right to demand that answer, and you have a right not to be told, if we can't be bothered to protect you, you cannot protect yourselves. We are Canadians, and Canadians are free people. That is why we are prosperous. That is why we were strong in 2 world wars and the Cold War. That is why a country of 35 million people is a G8 country. It is why we have a lifestyle that attracts people from around the world, most of them worthy citizens and a few of them aggressive parasites, but mostly very good people who want to live in Canada because Canada's better. Well, Canada's better because here the state obeys the citizens. That's the story that we should be proud of. We should say, I am Canadian, I am free, I am an inheritor of Magna Carta. And every time some immigrant comes to this country and it becomes a citizen, I would give them a copy of Magna Carta and say, welcome to Canada. This is who we are. And if we approach the problem in that spirit, it won't be easy, but we will get back control of our government. We will not be told governments that are spending $1 billion a week have no money for policing. We will not be told if they do hire extra police, they need to be on photo radar duty. We will not be told that all the criminals are misunderstood and that it's impossible to make any of them serve long sentences. We will not be told our safety is not the state's problem, because that is un-Canadian. And if we stand up and say that unapologetically, and we tell people who doubt it that that is true and here is why it is true, we tell them the story of a free people, then we will also be a safe and secure people. Because that's who Canadians are, and that is who Canadians must remain. Now I'm going to turn it over to Danny for some more practical ideas, but remember always to stand straight, shoulders back, look the government in the eye and say, you work for me. I do not work for you because I am Canadian. Thank you.